Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Ome.
Thank you. And so, of course, we're still involved in this confrontation, this first confrontation between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh. And we're still, he's reacting, Pharaoh's reacting to their request and their insistence that he allow the Israelites to go for a 3 day into the wilderness and to serve God. So he's come back with saying, the fact that you're asking for this must be an indication that you're taking people away from their work. Okay. So in the future, because apparently you got so much time to complain, we're going to give you more work. So that remember that originally, of course, in order to make the bricks, they had to take straw and knead it with the clay, and then they'd make the bricks. Well, and in the past, the straw had been provided for them, but now the straw wouldn't be provided for them anymore. They'd have to go and collect the straw as well. And he goes on to say, "Et matkonet halevanim," and the quota, that's the way Safaria translates this, and I think it's a wonderful quote, the quota of bricks, asher hem osim tmol shilshom, which they were making previously. Tmol means yesterday, shilshom 3 days ago. So in other words, in the past, tasimu alehem, you shall place upon them, you shall require the same quota. Lo tirga'u mimenu, you shall not reduce it. You shouldn't reduce the quota. Ki nirfimhem, because they're lazy. Al kainhem tuakim lemor, and that's the reason they're crying out and saying, "Nelcha b'nizbacha l'Eloheinu." Let's go, allow us to go and sacrifice and worship our God. So this word matkonet is a little bit of a new word out there. It's not a common word. So Rashi's taking a look at matkonet halevanim. So he says chum cheshbon halevanim. In other words, it's the amount of the number of bricks that needed to be produced. Shaya kol echad oseh layom, that everyone was doing per day, producing per day. Keshaya hateven nitan lahem, when the straw was given to them. Or toschum, that same amount, tasimu alahem, you shall place upon them, gamata, even now. Laman tichbad ha'avodah, so as to make the work more burdensome, alahem, upon them. Ki nirpim, because they've sloughed off, right? They're disengaged, min ha'avodah, from the work. They're not concentrating on their work, getting it all done. They figure they have spare time because they aren't working that hard. Haim, okay, avodah, min ha'avodah haim. They're sloughing off. They're disengaging from the work. Lachach libam poneh el habetela, and that's why their attention is being paid to idle thoughts, idle ideas, idleness, v'tzakim lemolecha, and for that reason they are crying out and saying, "Let's go." Okay, etc., etc. Matkonet. There's the word matkonet. V'tochen levanim. So in other words, the number of bricks. Velo nitkanu velo. Okay, levanim velo velu nitkanu alilot. Okay, and so I'm trying to think, make sure I'm reading this correctly, right? It's a quote. It's a quote. Velo means to him, nitkanu alilot, deeds are counted. Alila is a deed, nitkanu, there's that matkonet, right, that Rashi's trying to give us. So he's giving us this word in a different context. And I actually did quote the passage. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. It's from the first book of Samuel, chapter 2, verse 3. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him here, they say deeds are weighed, right? Deeds are counted. By him, by God, deeds are counted. So that's the quote Rashi is using to explain this word matkonet, right? Ve'et hakesef hamitukan, right? So this is talking about Joseph's brothers, referring to the amount of money that had been set aside to buy the grain, right? So there we are. Kulam lashon cheshbonem. They all have to do with taking account. Nirpim, this is a word that we've translated as lazy or sloughing off. Hamelacha refuya. So there's the nirpim, that the labor has become loose in their hands. In other words, they're not as attached, they're not as devoted to their labors sufficiently. For azuva, they're disengaged, mayhem. It's become disengaged. For hem nirpim miminu, and so they're sloughing off from it. They're loosening their attachment to it. And here is the French word, so the retrait, balaz, right? So in other words, you can see the word retreat, where it means you disengage, right? You go away. So this, I'm sure that this is the connection there. And here we go, zurück gezogen, right? That means in Yiddish, zurück means backwards. Gezogen means they retracted. They went, yes, they retracted. They went back. Going on to verse 9. Tichbat ha'avodah, right? Al ha'anashim v'yasuba, right? I believe he's saying, let the labor be placed upon them. In other words, let it become heavier on the people, and let them make sure they do it. Okay, let them take care of go back to work and concentrate on your work. For al yishu b'divrei shaker, and let them not speak. This again, this word yishu, Rashi's going to have to comment on it because it's an uncommon word for speaking. They shouldn't talk about nonsense. Divrei shaker literally means lying words, nonsense. Let's take a look. Here we go. Ve'al yishu b'divrei shaker. Ve'al yehegu, they shouldn't think. Ve'yidabru tamid b'divrei ruach, and speak and constantly speak about vain matters. Divrei ruach means literally matters of the wind, vain. Lay more to say, to say, let's go, allow us to go and to worship, to sacrifice. Vedomelo, and he says this is similar to another verse. Is actually, I believe, from Psalm maybe 119. Va'esha bechukecha tamid, and I will constantly speak of your laws. Lemashal ulashina ulashinina, right? Okay, so he's saying, I believe he says, as I think he's saying, as an example, he is not himself saying, he's saying that these words, lemashal ulashinina, for an example, and as a topic, metargaminan, he's saying we translate, or rather we see in the translation into Aramaic, ulishavin or something, ulishuin. So there it is. So, or else he is saying, the mashal, for example, could be, right? This word ulishinina, metargamim lishuin. Vayisaper, and he says Vayisaper. He told, he recounted Vaishta'e. There's this sha'e, this root sha'e, meaning to speak, to talk about it. And he says it's possible that one might want to translate it a different way. And he says Ve'iev shar lomar, and you cannot say lomar that yish'o lashon vayesha Hashem. It doesn't, because of this because of the way it's being used in the sentence, you cannot say that it has the meaning of Vayesha Hashem el Hevel or Vayisha Hashem el Hevel, that the Lord turned to Abel, right? Remember when Cain and Abel brought their sacrifices, and this is the verb that is used there in terms of how God accepted Abel's sacrifice and did not, right? Ve'el Cain ve'el minchato, and to Cain and his gift, lo sha'ah. There's that verb. So, it means to turn to. So here he's saying that the word sha'ah here means to speak, and here it means to turn. He says, don't say they shouldn't turn to idle things, right? That it means they should speak about idle things. And he's making a point not to be confused. Ulefaresh al yishu al yifnu. In other words, and to translate that as where Pharaoh is saying it, that they shouldn't Alif knew that they shouldn't turn to, as opposed to they shouldn't speak about. She'im kain, because if in fact it did mean to turn to, hayalo lichtov, it would have the verse should have stated va'al yishu el divrei sheker. In other words, it should have used this preposition, right? They should not turn to nonsense or false, vain words, etc., or lid divrei. So the lamed is also right a prefix that's a prepositional prefix. El and la in el as a word, la in front of the word as a preposition, right? That it uses the word to le divrei sheker, right, or divrei shaker. Ki chen gzerat kulam, because all of them, in other words, when it's sha'ah meaning turn to, this is the way it works in the grammar. The syntax works that way, right? So he gives an example in Isaiah 17, Yish'eh ha'adam al osehu, let a man turn, and there he's saying it, there it means al osehu, to the one who made him, or for the one who said it. Or on the one who made him, right? That's and then also chapter 31. It says Velo sha'u el kadosh Israel, and they did not turn. And notice the preposition el. They did not turn to the Holy One of Israel. And again in chapter 17, Velo yishe el hamizbachot, and they should not turn to those altars. Okay, so there, every time that it means turn, this is the preposition that it uses. Velo matzati shimush shel bet. And he says, I never saw in this particular context, when I meant to turn to it, that they use the letter bet, smucha la'acharehem, that bet would come after the word sha'ah when it means to turn to. Aval achar lashon dibur, but if sha'ah means speaking, right? Kemit asek ladavar. He's like talking about something, right? So sha'eh means talking about. Okay, so dibur. Okay, lashon dibur kemitasek ledaber badavar, as one who is engaged in speaking about something. Nofel lashon shimush bet. In that case, the bet is used as a preposition. For example, and they gives examples about this. Ezekiel 33, hanidabrim b'chas. There's the ba, right? Who have a discussion about you. And again in Numbers 12, Vatidaber Miriam v'Aharon b'Moshe. Notice, right? So it means, there it says, and Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moses. So the sha'ah there means speaking about. Zechariah, right? Chapter 4, Hamalach hadover bi, right? The angel who spoke about me. Deuteronomy 11, Ledaber Bam, right? The famous passage from the Shema, right? To speak about them and to speak about the words of Torah. And again, so when you're speaking about this preposition, b means, literally it means in or about, etc. And again, there we go, here we go. Psalm 119, Va'adabra there's the edotecha, and I will speak about your testimonies. Afkan, and so here too, al yishu bedivrei sheker. So there, because it's got this b here, it means do not speak about lying things. Al yiyu nidbarim bedivrei shav v'havai. They shouldn't be talking about things that are vain and useless. So quite an extensive discussion here where Rashi is talking about the possible mistranslation of something and he's trying to prove that the way he's understanding this word is correct, that it's here, it means speaking and it doesn't mean turning to. And I think the reason why he does that is because he's seen translations of this passage as meaning turn. They shouldn't turn to. Okay. Okay. Vayetzu nogse ha'am v'shotrav, right? So the taskmasters and the officers went out, vayomru el ha'am, and they said to the people, lemor, these particular words, ko amar paro, thus says Pharaoh, this is what Pharaoh commands, enini noten lachem teven, I'm not going to give you straw anymore. Atem lechu, and as for you, lechu, go, k'chu lachem tevel, go and collect straw, me'asher timtsa'u, wherever you can find it, ki ein nigra mi avodatchem davar, because the amount of work you have to do is not reduced at all. You're going to have to make the same number of bricks as you did before, even though you now have to collect the straw yourselves. So you better try and get it wherever you can. Atem lechu k'chu lachem tevel, and that's where you go and take straw. Utrichim atem lelech bizrizut, and you're going to have to go with alacrity. You're going to have to do this as quick as you can. Okay. Ki ein nigra davar, because nothing is reduced. Mikol schum levainim, from the entire tale of bricks, in other words, the number of bricks you have that you were making, sheyitim osim layom, that was required of you daily, biyot hateven nitan lachem, when straw was given to you, mizumam, when it was prepared, mi beit hamelech, from the king's house. In other words, that when the king provided it for you. Vayafetz ha'am b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, and the people spread out throughout the land of Egypt, lekoshesh kash latevan. So this is the verb we're using, in other words, to try and prepare straw prepare the straw. So kash is straw, teven is again this another word for this particular commodity. It also means, here we go, the koshesh kash latevel. So he says le'esof, okay? So in other words, to gather. Asifa lilkot leket, right? So in other words, they had to go and collect whatever they could find in terms of the straw, the tzorech teven hatit, in order to, and I think here he means teven hatit, the straw for the bricks. In other words, so teven here possibly is a word that describes the combination of the straw and the clay in order to make the bricks. Kash lashon likut. So he says this word kash, which so often we simply translate as straw, it has the connotation of likut al shem. Okay, so he means to gather, something like that. Al shem shedavar hamitpazer, and the reason is that it is something that is spread out. Straw is all around the fields. V'tzarich lekoshesho. So, in other words, one has to go and put it together. One has to gather the straw together. Karui kash b'sha'ar mekomot, and it's called straw in other places, in other contexts. So, going on. V'hanogsim atzim lemor, and the taskmasters they were urging the people, saying, Kalu ma'asechem dvar yom v'yomor. Make sure you complete your tasks every day, kasher b'yot hateven, when the straw was provided. You need to make sure it's got to be the exact same amount, even when you had when you had it, same as much. Atzim dochakim, they pushed them, they kept pushing them. Davar yom biyomo. So in other words, it means cheshbon shel kol yom, the amount of every day. Uh, uh, Let me make sure. Kalu, I believe, right? In other words, finish up. Make sure you complete the entire amount biyomo in its day. Kasher asitim biyotateven muchan, just as you did when the straw was prepared for you. Going on. Vayuku shotrei bnei Israel, and the officers of the children of Israel were beaten. Asher samu alehem, which had been placed over them, the officers who had been placed over them, responsible for them, they were noksei paro lemor. So, in other words, the taskmasters of Pharaoh beat the officers of the Israelites. Remember, that the taskmasters were Egyptians and the officers were Israelites, and they were beating the taskmasters, were beating the Israelites and saying, Madua lo chilitem chokchem? Why did you not complete, right? Chilitim hakeven chokchem, the amount lilbon to make bricks. In other words, why didn't you make sure that you completed the entire amount, kitmol shilshom, like you did before? Okay, gam tmol gam hayom, just as you did yesterday, today as well, exactly the same amount, and they were beating them because they weren't able to do that. So, vayaku shotrei v'nei Israel. So they vayuku, right? That's a passive form. That is, the officers of the children of Israel were beaten. Hashotrim Yisraelim hayu, right? So in other words, the officers were Israelites. V'chasim al chaverehem, and they had some mercy. They took pity on their fellows. Mi lidochkam, and they didn't want to keep pushing them hard, right? Forcing them. Ucheshayu mashlimim halavainim nogtzim, and when they had to pay off, right, when they would give the bricks to the taskmasters, shehem mitzriim, who were Egyptian, vayachaser min haschum, and when there was less, something was missing from the total amount, hayu malkin otam, right? Those taskmasters would beat them al shelo dachaku et osei hamalacha, because the Israelite officers hadn't urged them so sufficiently, they hadn't pushed on them enough, forced them as much. Lefichach, but there's a reason. So in other words, these officers were taking it on the chin for the Israelites. So here we go. Lefichach zachu otan shotrim, and for that reason, these particular officers merited liot Sanhedrin. They wound up being the Sanhedrin. V'ne'etzal min haruach asher al Moshe, and they were some of the divine spirit that was given to Moses was placed on them. Right? There's a place in Numbers where Moses complains about all his responsibilities, and he feels he needs to be able to share some of them. And we talk about how some of that spirit, that divine spirit of prophecy, was lifted from Moses and given to these people, to the 70 elders. So, v'husam alehem, and it was placed upon them, these officers, shene'emar, as it says there, asfer li shiv'im ish, gather for me 70 men, miziknei Israel, of the elders of Israel. In other words, so it says, me'otan shi'adata, right, hatova she'asu b'mitzrayim. So in other words, me'otan, from them, shi'adata, because you know, Moses, the goodness that they did in Egypt, kihem ziknei ha'am v'shotrav, that it's the elders of the people and their officers. Vayuku Vayaku shotrei bnei Israel, and Vayuku, right? The officers of the children of Israel were beaten. Asher samu nogse paro otam l'shotrim. In other words, the ones that the taskmasters of Pharaoh had placed as officers, alayhim over them, lemor madua, to saying why, etc. Lama vayuku shehayu umrim. So why were they being beaten? Shahayu omrim lahem, because they were saying to them, in the process of beating them, I believe Rashi is telling us, Madua loch litim gam tmol gam hayom. In other words, in the process of beating these officers, the taskmasters were saying, telling them why they were beating them, right? Hayom, let's make sure. Chok, I believe that is the amount, right? Hakatsuv aleichem, that was established for you. Lilbon kitmol hashlishi, right? In other words, let me make sure that it's saying, in other words, this is Lilbon means to create the bricks, to make the bricks, to manufacture the bricks. Kitmol, like yesterday, hashlishi, the third day, shehu yom shelifnei etmol. So, shilshom would be, it is the day before yesterday. And at that particular point, the straw was given to them those many days ago. Vayuku lashon vayuf alu. So he's telling us that this term vayuku is a passive form. In other words, it was done to them. Huku miyad acherim. In other words, they were beaten at the hands of others. Anoksim hikum. Okay, that is to say, the taskmasters actually were beating them. And I'm going to stop here for today, and we'll pick it up on Friday next time. We find the place. Right, here we go. So, of course, the officers have their reaction. And here we go. Find the place here. There we are for tomorrow, or rather for Friday next time. Thank you. I'll stop the share. Okay. All right, here's your moment on record. Yes, Harlan.
Uh, what were the bricks used for?
The construction. They were used for constructing the various store cities and things that Pharaoh wanted.
Oh,
Okay. Interesting,
okay.
right? How the creation of these particular monuments, etc., and these buildings, right? Because buildings have a certain permanence, and so I think that's part of the idea is that it's kind of an immortality that someone's trying to create for themselves, or else
Well,
to display their power and their magnificence.
the pyramids are still there.
Yes, whether or not we're talking about the pyramids, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure maybe some of the pyramids are made with bricks, but for the most part, I think they're made out of stone, and they're pretty amazing as to how they managed to move the stones, these heavy stones, and create the pyramids. So,
Yeah.
but here we are talking about bricks, which is interesting. It's more in line with the way they made buildings in Babylonia,
Oh.
but they talk about them here. So whatever they were, we were.
So Moses got in trouble with the Israelis when that's why they had those extra straws to do because Moses was the Pharaoh didn't like what Moses was saying, and he said, "Well, you're getting lazy. Okay, you're going to have more work."
Very human. David, did you want to say something?
I was going to say that do you think that because the soldiers took it on the chin,
Yes.
had the soldiers forced the Israelites to do what the Pharaoh wanted, there would have been more Israelites that left Egypt?
I'm not sure I follow the logic that you're saying here.
Sounds to me like the Israelite soldiers were the ones that were being punished.
Correct.
not the Israelites, the workers themselves.
That's the
Had
point being made
had
here.
had
Yeah.
the Israelite workers been felt the pain,
Mm,
more might have left.
mm. I don't know. It's kind of cool that you're making these connections. I don't know. I don't know. I think that simply on a practical level, if you're looking at the division of labor, this was the way it had to be done. In other words, this is nothing new. As somebody mentioned in a previous lesson, I think Morris maybe, that they had capos in the concentration camps, or when the Jews were in ghettos under the Nazi regime, the Nazis used Jews to organize the community and held those Jews responsible. Okay, so look at this, how nothing changes. So likewise, Pharaoh has his own people, right, the Egyptians, and then they organize the community, and the community has its leaders, and they hold the leaders responsible. So I don't, I can't answer your question directly. I think what you're trying to say, if I'm following you, is that maybe more Israelites would have been worthy of leaving because of having to take the pain. But the truth is, they still had to take the pain. The Israelites themselves still had to, come up with the bricks. And the point is that what the Torah is doing here is discussing the dynamics, the emotional dynamics that were going on, because the officers, the Israelite officers, found themselves caught in the middle, and they wanted to be decent to their brothers, and they couldn't be. They had to take it up themselves. And we see this kind of thing. It hasn't changed in terms of, human cruelty and people trying to come up with clever ideas in order to get done what they want to get done. I just think it's fascinating, the psychology involved that the Torah is bringing out here. And, if you don't read the Torah carefully, you don't realize how relevant it is, how in a sense nothing's changed. So, yeah. I think that the reason why there were so many Israelites who didn't make it, which I think is what's concerning you right now, is that they weren't worthy of it, unfortunately. That they did not have enough faith, they didn't have, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in a way, if we try to say, well, what's the Torah or what's the tradition trying to tell us? Because the Torah itself doesn't speak about that, but the tradition does. Is there a certain point that it's making is that, we don't have, even though we're Jews, it doesn't mean we're privileged to get away with stuff. In some ways, and I think this comes out with Amos, uh, that the fact that if Jews are in a privileged position, it means they have even more responsibility. That if we consider ourselves to be, God's chosen people or something, it means that we have even more responsibility to act with faith and kindness and compassion, and that we're going to be held accountable even more, and not that we're privileged. So that could be part of what the rabbis are trying to teach us, in saying that a very high number of Israelites did not get out of Egypt, that they died during the plague of darkness. Yeah. Okay. Till next time.